All right, grade 10s. We have been working on three types of assessment this year. We've done a lot with the A1, we've done a little bit less with A2, and we've done the least amount of work with multiple choice. And good news, multiple choice is worth the most of the three. So one half of your mark is multiple choice, and I thought, hey, now might be a good time to do some practice questions together, just as a break from your research. So what we have here would be a test that has little snowflakes next to the right answers. Too bad they couldn't all be like that. So we already know the answer. Now we want to reverse engineer and make sure we understand how it is the answer. So looking at number 5, the above poster focuses most directly on the problem of. So before I look at the source, I would always read the question. So first step is always read the question. Always read what we call as the stem and say, okay, why am I looking at the source? So here the stem says the above poster focuses most directly on the problem of. And then there's 4 options. And I might consider the differences between the 4 options before I look at the poster as well. So the 4 options say carrying capacity. And I'm going to pause, I'm going to try to say, okay, what does that word mean? Carrying capacity, that's talking about population and how many people can fit on the planet Earth. Next up, stewardship. And then I might try to consider what it means and what it might look like, and how is it different than option A. So how is carrying capacity and stewardship different? Then I move on to disparity, and then I move on to poverty. And then, after I've considered the 4 options, now I'm going to take a look at the source. So now that I've already created some links in my mind, I've created those neural pathways have linked up, and I've tried to recall what those 4 words mean, now I'm going to look at the source with some intention of trying to match this up. And so much multiple choice comes down to matching. So I'm taking this source here, and I'm matching. Is this carrying capacity? Is this stewardship? Is this disparity? Is this poverty? Well, we know the answer is disparity because there's snowflake, but why is it disparity? Who can tell us why it's disparity? So in order to get this question right, you'd have to have a understanding of vocabulary. 100% this is a vocabulary question. So at the end of this unit, because this is a unit 3 exam, and at the end of this unit, as early as next Thursday, not this, but next Thursday, today's Tuesday, so just over a week away, we need to have vocabulary. We need to understand terms like this. So as you're reading the articles and you're reading words, and as I'm talking about words, for multiple choice, it's really about language building. The number 1 obstacle is language. Because if you have a question like number 5 here, and you're like, man, I don't know what disparity means, you're not going to get the question right unless you just guess it right. And when you have the need to be guessing, you might end up with around 25%, which won't be enough. So, one hint for next week is to create a vocabulary list, a glossary, right? That's one way to study, is to study the language. Once you know the language, you know disparity means rich and poor, a gap between rich and poor. What content within this source says, this is disparity? Well, it talks about the richest 1% owning 40% of the world's wealth. So what it's talking about is an unequal distribution of wealth, where the top 1% own 40% of the planet's wealth. That is disparity. So this is a type of question that would be more vocabulary based and an application of vocabulary based upon an illustration. So again, how do you study for it? You need to get the vocabulary down. And once you have the vocabulary down, then on the test, you need to be able to go through those steps. But first step before the test is getting the vocab down. Number 6, which issue is raised by the poster? So again, I might look at all 4 issues, regulation versus deregulation. And I might pause and say, well, what does that look like? Regulation versus deregulation. And then if I can't hold 4 things in my mind at once, I might go back and just look at the source just for that one thing. regulation versus deregulation. So if I can't hold all four of these things in my mind at once, I'm going to get confused. I'm going to go A, B, C, and D. I'm going to check back 4 times. And take a little bit longer, but this way I'm going to make sure that I don't get confused on the question. So regulation versus deregulation. Again, if you don't know what the words mean, you're stuck guessing again. So a key step is building your language. Income gap between social classes. Private ownership versus public ownership, and economic inequality between the developed world and the developing world. Well, we're talking about inequality for sure, so there's a pull to D for that, but we're not talking about the developed or the the world that includes Canada, United States, Japan, against the developing world. We're talking about classes. We're talking about 1% and 40%, 1% owning 40% of the wealth. So we're talking about social classes, so it's going to be B. Now, better than income gap between social classes, a better phrase might be, because we're talking about wealth and not income, might be wealth gap between social classes. Because somebody could own a lot of stuff, but maybe they don't have an income. What was Donald Trump's income last year, as opposed to what's his wealth? 2 different measures. So the poll is to B, but if I was recreating the question, I might put the word wealth, because wealth and income are different terms. They're related, but not necessarily 100% the same. But I'm guessing if you put the word wealth gap, this question becomes a little bit too easy. Let's look at number 7. So again, some students might go to number 7, they might read through the 2 statements first. And my comment would be, well, do you know your purpose for reading them? First, read the question. Which of the following observations regarding the above statements is correct? So basically, we're just trying to figure out if they're true or false. So I'm going to read them and put a T next to them for true and an F next to them for false. The majority of the world's environmental scientists believe that global warming is occurring and humans are very likely responsible for causing it. Well, that is true. Many scientists predict that global warming will eventually cause massive flooding of coastal areas in various regions of the world. Not only is that true, but it's happening now. So they're both true, and it is C. So again, these are what I might call moderate mental activity questions. They're recall questions. We'll see harder questions, more skill-based questions later, but these are ones that, this is just recalling things that you've studied about climate change. Number 8 is also recall in the sense that it's cast of characters time. And they're saying, hey, we've come across some key economists like Frederick Hayek and Milton Friedman, and what do they have in common? So not only is it going to be to your benefit for multiple choice to have a list of key terms, it's also to your benefit to have a list of cast of characters. And again, grade 10 is about getting the steps down so that you can be successful in grade 11 and 12. So if you come out of grade 10 with a 66, but you come out of grade 10 with an understanding of what is now required to be successful, you may have success in 21 and 31. But if you come out of grade 10 with an 82, and you're not doing any of these things, you're not going to finish 30-1. You won't. It's going to be too much content. It's going to go by too quickly. It's going to be too many terms, too many people, and you won't keep up. So you need to develop the skills today. So sometimes in preseason, and this is kind of like preseason, sometimes in preseason, you may lose a game or 2 as you're trying to learn a new offense. But in the end, by learning that offense, you're going to be successful later in the actual season when it counts. Universities do look at your grade 11 marks for early admission, but it's your grade 12 marks to get you a spot. Grade 10 marks matter a little bit, and that's just because there is some Rutherford money in grade 10. So if you can carry an average of 75 or an average of 80, There's different types of increments of Rutherford money. That's about it. We want you more than being fixated on a number this year. We want you to be fixated on the process. And what could I be doing day to day to build my skills? And these are things that need to be done. Which type of trade agreement is most common in today's world? So we looked at NAFTA, and when we looked at NAFTA, they mentioned other trade blocs around the world. Most economists believe that the United States clearly began to dominate the global economy when? Well, certainly not 2005, because the challenge of China has been, and by 2005 became quite clear. All right, so we also have some common questions that are based upon sources. Here we got 4 newspaper headlines, lots going on here. Before I look at what's going on there, I need to say, okay, what am I looking at? So, number 11 is a very common style of a question. All 4 newspaper headlines focus on something. So again, it comes down to matching. And matching is not a difficult skill. So some of these multiple choice questions, skill-wise, they're not challenging you skill-wise, they're challenging you knowledge-wise. And therefore we have some studying to do. Waiting for someone to get concussed by falling out of their desk this year. Just boom, hard on the ground. All 4 newspaper headlines focus on. So let's consider our 4 options before we look at it. The issue of global warming, agricultural issues of globalization. There's a difference between A and B. You know, A is more specific. It's about climate. It's about global warming. B is more specific to agriculture. C, problems resulting from shortages of energy and water resources. So C is very specific. If they're talking about water and energy, it's going to be C. D, problems caused by the introduction of foreign plants and animals. All 4 of them, although connected under an umbrella of environmental concerns, all 4 of them have different types of ideas being presented. So then I go back, and when I go back, I might go back and I might put an A next to each one that A applies to, a B next to each one that B applies to, a C for every C, and a D for every D, and then if I have 4 A's, I know the answer is A. There's no reason to get this question wrong. You just have to spend the time on it. All 4 newspaper headlines focus on. So the top one says, Africa will suffer most from increased water scarcity and water stress. So I see C there. I don't see any reference to B, agricultural issues. Problems created by the introduction of foreign plants. It didn't mention any D. And water stress is under that big umbrella of global warming. So we've got A's and C's on that top left. Top right, scientists warn that most polar bears could be gone by 2050. Well, we don't have another C there. It's not shortage of energy or water. This is something different. That's a D now. But could it fit under global warming? Yes, it could. So even after just looking at the top 2, the only answer long or wide enough to embrace both the Observer Dispatch and the Daily World is A. Because those 2 are looking at C and D respectively, but also under that big umbrella of A. Then we look at the Times Herald. Al Gore praises Canadian government ban on incandescent light bulbs. That's energy use. Light bulbs, so maybe C. Emissions could trigger a global flood or a global food crisis in the next half century. So I guess a lot of people, if they get it wrong, might be pulled to C. Because we have energy here. There's really no energy here, right? We can infer that the polar bears could be gone because of use of energy. But the one thing that's big enough for all 4 to fit under, these are issues attached to global warming. So take your time, go through it once, go through it in depth, and then when you're done number 11 and you're like, you know what, I got this one right, check mark by it on the test so you know you don't need to go back to it. At the end of the test, you should have time to go back over some, but you don't want to go back over ones that you were sure you were correct the first time. Be there in the moment. You know, that's the key to success. And in order to be there in the moment, you need to be on number 11 when you're on number 11. You can't still be thinking about number 10. So if you weren't sure, put a question mark, and then you can relieve the fact that you weren't sure about it. You know you're going to come back and revisit it. But if you're done number 11 and you're happy, put a check mark, and then you can be there for number 12 in the moment. All you're focused on then, number 12. So sometimes our best students on multiple choice are students that just have that skill to just focus on what's the one thing I'm doing right now. And sometimes it's to the detriment of others in class. Because there may be a student that does well on multiple choice and you're like, oh man, why is Joey doing so well? Joey doesn't put in the work. Maybe something else is happening there for Joey then. The headline from the Sun, so now all we have to do is look at the Sun. The headline from the Sun most probably refers to declining food production as a result of what? Aside from the awkward language with most probably, looking at this, we're trying to link it with one of these. That this is a result of one of these. So emissions could trigger a global food crisis in the next half century. Why would that happen? Would it be drought, overfishing, worldwide urban expansion, increased food consumption associated with the globalization of obesity? Man, that last one's a stretch. Now, that one's really a reach. And there's a 3-1 split where it really stands out from the other ones because it's such a long answer, a long distractor. So, why is it drought? Emissions could trigger a global food crisis in the next half century. Why is it drought and not overfishing? Why is it A and not B? There's nothing in the article that is saying that emissions could trigger a global food crisis in the next half century for those who rely upon, fish or other things coming from the ocean or from lakes and rivers. It's saying global food crisis. It's not specifically saying in the ocean due to overfishing. If there was something about, overfishing, then it could easily be B, but there's no reference there to it. Worldwide urban expansion. So emissions from growing cities, if it had something like that, emissions from the incursion of human footprint on the natural biosphere, then it could be that. But it just says emissions could trigger a global food crisis. So emissions could trigger a global food crisis in the next half century. Emissions could change the climate and create drought. So there's a couple of steps involved in finding it out. I'll do a couple more. I'm not going to do all of them here. Let's look at number 15 and 16. So here we have a cartoon, but before we start looking at the detail within the cartoon, let's see if we know what we're looking for. Number 15, which issue is addressed by the above cartoon? So we need to find an issue. And looking at the nuances or the details within the cartoon, it says world economy, and there's a whole bunch of interlocking hubs or wheels, some mechanical mechanisms that rely upon each other. So much like a clock has some inner pieces that if this piece of a clock stops working, it's going to impact the ability of the other connected pieces. So because of the interconnectedness, we're going to have issues here. So A, which issue could be in that cartoon? To what extent should technological globalization be encouraged? Well, those wheels could be seen as, technology, sure, they're pieces of machines. And you could say that, because we have embraced a technological world, we're now dependent upon the technology that comes from others. And because we've embraced that, we're eventually going to get sick. There's a little bit of a pull there. So I might put an M for maybe, but I'm not confident that that is the right answer. B, to what extent are nations economically interdependent. Well, when I looked at the cartoon, the word interdependent was the first thing that came to my mind. So not only to what extent are nations interdependent, but to what extent is that a good thing? Because the United States is catching a sickness, then they are likely to become infected. To what extent are nations economically interdependent definitely fits. To what extent is globalization increasing or reducing the risk of a global pandemic? Well, we see the idea of pandemics because they're sick. But what about the economy part? World economy is the title. So if it had said to what extent is, economic globalization increasing the risk of pandemic, there might be a bigger pull to that. But is the sickness coming out of the US here in the world economy meant to be a literal sickness? Or is it a metaphorical economic sickness? Is it a recession, so it's an economic sickness, or is it COVID-19? The cartoonist's main point is that in a globalizing world, the economic problems of one nation may affect others. So the United States in 2007, 2008 had a financial meltdown. It causes the Great Recession. In 1929, the United States has a stock market crash. It causes the Great Depression. So in both of those cases, an economic sickness coming out of the United States ends up infecting the world. So that is deep. So, number 19, the term stewardship refers to straight recall, right? Straight recall of multiple choice. Some you can see here are application-based, some are source-based with cartoons, and the source-based ones with cartoons we've probably done our most practice in class, because that was a skill I was assuming you didn't have. But the questions that I'm seeing that you guys struggle on in the multiple choice, they're not those ones. They're the ones that are, hey, do you know what stewardship means? So again, I would suggest to you that the next step that you need to do in the 9 days before our next midterm is to focus on the language. So we're going to have a mass break in about 20 minutes. Keep working, and as you're working, don't just read past words you don't know. If there's a word there that you don't know, like carrying capacity, biodiversity, those could be the building blocks of your questions. One of the points of doing research is to get to know the language. So keep on doing your research. There's your break. Not your mass break, but your break from research.